Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Barry Soper. Politics has been my business for more than 30 years. John Key's the 8th Prime Minister that I've traipsed around the world after. Last week was no exception in South America. I'm currently the political editor for News Talk ZB and for Sky Television. And in that capacity, I in fact covered the dying stages of the presidential race. And of course, in Mitt Romney's case, it literally was the dying stages, which we'll be talking about tonight a bit. It is wonderful to be in this Fisher and Paykel auditorium, although our iconic company now belongs to the Chinese. So I guess we should be thanking them tonight for this as well. And the Owen Glen building, I do remember when it was opened, Helen Clark, Trevor Mallard trying to keep her away from Owen Glen for the traditional photograph. And that had a lot to do with politics. We're going to be discussing tonight the reflections on a presidential campaign and what's more from a New Zealand perspective. Chris Liddell's an honours engineering graduate from this university and is arguably one of the country's most successful expat businessmen, although he was pretty successful when he was here in New Zealand as well. He was the former head, of course, of Carter Holt Harvey, International Paper is the CFO of, as he was of Microsoft and General Motors. But it's in his role as executive director of the Mitt Romney Transitional Planning Team that is the key to tonight's discussion. I think even he might admit that he's not the best known businessman in this country, so I thought we'd delve into what basically has driven him in his life, which included going to Oxford University to complete a Master of Philosophy degree, which no doubt equipped him well for his later foray into politics. So, Chris, without further ado, you grew up in Auckland. An engineering degree is not something that you would usually associate with business. So what got you interested in business?
Well, I think engineering is a great discipline for anything. And it comes to education generally. Education and a degree is training the mind as much as training you in a skill. So, what do I remember of engineering? Virtually nothing. What do most, even engineers of my age who are still in engineering remember of engineering? Virtually nothing. So it's really a training of the mind. So engineering was fantastic for me because it gave me a skill base really around sort of project management. And in fact, it was relevant to the Romney situation because what I was doing was a big project management skill. But engineering was great. I was good at maths and physics, so it was a logical thing for me to gravitate into. And it really taught me skills around logical thinking, practical project management, getting stuff done, simplifying things, delivering on results, et cetera, et cetera. And that, to be honest, has been incredibly useful in everything that I've done there afterwards. And I was lucky, as you mentioned, that I went on and then did a literary degree. So I had the training both on the logical side through engineering, but then I also complemented it, fortunately in my case, with a literary degree, which was much more about conceptual thinking. So again, that gave me some skills that I went on. Have I taught or used philosophy in any great way? No. But did it teach me to think in a certain way that's been applicable to all sorts of jobs and roles? Absolutely.
Do you think it's given you maybe a bit of a softer edge?
No, I think the people who work with me would say softer edge is not one of my main skills. It's taught me to think about things in a hopefully curious and reasonably conceptual way. That really has probably been the basic underpinning of everything I've done.
I've read that when you interview people for jobs, which you've done on many occasions, that you ask them to sum up their lives in 3 words, and you know what's going to come. What are the 3 words that would sum you up?
That's a good question because it changes over life, and that's the reason why I do it. If I can answer that, and then I'll talk about myself, is I'm looking for a few things. One, I'm looking for people with the ability to do that, because normally if you can't condense complex things into simple, in this case 3 words, it generally shows you've got a cluttered mind, and most of the things I'm doing don't allow themselves to have cluttered minds. So people who are able to take a concept and make it very crisp is important. So that's one of the reasons I do it, and then I'm looking for keywords depending on the role. In terms of me, it's changed a lot actually, but I would say at the moment I'm balanced. I'm much more balanced than I've ever been in my life.
Is that age?
Probably, yeah. And age and stage and having done a lot of interesting things, keep putting that in perspective. So, and I wouldn't have used balance probably any other time in my life. I'm curious. I'm probably more interested about what's going on around me and what's going on in the world than I've ever been. And positive, optimistic, one of those two. Just feel good about life in general.
If you thought back to when you were a young man here growing up in Auckland, did you ever envisage that the international stage was going to be your catwalk?
I always wanted to do something that was significant internationally, yeah. I guess if you'd asked me when I was 15 years old, I wanted to be an All Black. But my parents probably had a lot of amusement looking at that because, as you can see, I wasn't built for that particular role. But I always had an aspiration to do something globally. I would have had no conception of, no ability whatsoever to actually articulate what that was. And the things that I've done are, I could never have thought of that even 20 years ago, to be honest, let alone 40. But I always had some goal to do something really interesting and aspirational.
One thing you did do, of course, was be almost right at the top of Microsoft. I think some people here may be interested in what Bill Gates was like, presumably you met.
Yeah, Bill's a fascinating guy. He would be definitely one of the other, I play lots of games, and one of the other games is, who would you have around a table if you could choose 5 either living or dead people from history, who would you have around a table? Bill would be one of mine, even though I've spent a lot of time with him. He's one of the most fascinating people, and I think probably one of the most iconic people of our lifetime, not just from business, but generally because of what he's doing in philanthropy. How would I describe Bill? Smart, just probably the most intelligent, smart guy I've ever met, but not in a narrow technology sense, which is what he's most known for, in a very, very broad sense. He'd be the most well-read person I know in my life. Going into his library at his house is better than going into most libraries in the world, from history, politics, arts, everything. He would be the most well-read and most articulate person on virtually any topic I can think of.
Okay, from Microsoft you went on to General Motors, and as we know, President Obama bailed the company out in 2008. It was 2 years before you, I think, became the chief financial officer there, right? But you will have been aware that Mitt Romney said, let Detroit go bankrupt, arguing that the best way to help save the auto industry was through a structured bankruptcy. Do you think he was right?
Yeah, and of course it did go bankrupt, and that's one of the ironic things. General Motors did go bankrupt, and the
bailout still occurred.
The bailout occurred, and whether the government should have been the entity that did it or not is really the question. And should they have done it in the way they did? Companies go through bankruptcy all the time in the US. It's just part of the way in which they run businesses to allow bankruptcy so that from the ashes grows the company. Would General Motors have disappeared if it had gone through a private bankruptcy? No. It still would have produced cars. It still would have come up from the ashes and been the company it was. Whether the government should have been involved and effectively created a subsidy for the unions in the way that they did it, I argue not. The taxpayers will lose somewhere between $10 and $20 billion. So should it have gone through bankruptcy? Absolutely. Should the government have got involved? Probably it was necessary given the time, but the way in which they did it I don't think was the best way.
Of course, that leads us on to Mitt Romney. I guess you were sort of looking for something to do after General Motors, and you were introduced to Mitt Romney. What impressed you about him?
The thing that he's just a first-class human being. He's wonderful morals, wonderful family life, wonderful principles. He's as smart as hell. He's got a low ego, which I think is incredibly important.
Doesn't appear to have.
Oh,
when
no.
you see him on stage.
Why do you say that?
Well, because he seems to me very steely and contrived, rather than this compassionate man that you're painting.
Right, yeah, but that's a different thing from an ego. You know, he was doing it, and this again may not come up, he was wanting to be president of the United States, not so he could say what a great guy he was and that he was president. He was doing it because he believed that he could make the world a better place, and he could make America a better place. And he's one of those people, when you're in the room, and I take a lot from this because I've worked with people who are the opposite to this, he didn't have to be the smartest guy in the room, even though he was. And from a leadership point of view, I think that's incredibly important. You need to actually be able to listen to people around you. And even if you are the smartest guy, and even if you are the person with the best solution, listening to the people around you is incredibly important. And one of the things that impressed me was he was that. And in the meetings I was in with him, he would always seek opinions, listen to them, make a decision. So he was decisive, but that's different from having a big ego.
Where did you meet him?
I met him in New York, I guess it would be about 18 months ago now, about 13, 14 months before the election. I knew one of the people who supported him financially very well, and I got an introduction through that person. I met him and his wife, Anne, just at a business setting in New York. Spent about half an hour with him, chatted about what he wanted to do, what I wanted to do, and it was a common meeting of minds.
Did the politics, the actual cut of his cloth, or the process of politics interest you the most in joining up in that campaign?
I thought he was the best, the closest aligned to where I was conceptually.
Conservative?
I think he was enough in the centre that he could have actually brought people together, but he was conservative. And for my mind, the issues of the day and the issues of the next 5 to 10 years are fiscal. They're not social policy. I mean, social policy is important, but it's not what's going to define the next 5 to 10 years of our life. And the US desperately needs a new fiscal direction. And he was certainly the closest to how I thought that would happen. Being too extreme, it's not going to happen. So you need to be relatively close to the centre to actually get something done. But it definitely needs a different direction from where it's going at the moment.
You're also treasurer of the Romney campaign.
Yeah.
How much money are we talking about that you had to raise?
We raised almost $1 billion.
$1 billion?
Yeah, US.
Isn't that what politics, though, in the United States is all about? It's about who can raise the most money.
Well, clearly not.
Do they know where it's coming from?
Do the candidates?
The candidates.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, sure. They meet at fundraisers and they shake people's hands. They don't necessarily know exactly what check, but if you're at a private dinner or something with 20 people, generally there's a $50,000 ask to go to that dinner. So that they'll generally speaking know who it is, who's contributing, and all of it's made public. So the amount you can look online, you can see the amount that I gave, for example, or anyone else. So it's all, if you contribute to a political campaign, that has to be filed by the campaign as to the person's name and how much they gave.
Isn't there a problem, though, and we see it, I think, in this country as well, and David Shearer is a good example, that he dithers a lot, and there are so many people in his ear, like no doubt in Romney's ear, when they go out to talk, they're so worried about making a gaffe that they end up making a gaffe.
Yeah, but it depends on whether you think that the key element that you're choosing your leader is their ability to articulate in public.
But then a lot of people do, don't they?
Yeah, and my view is that's not the single thing that you should solve for. Their ability is to make high quality decisions based in, the President of the United States has to make more critical decisions than any one human being probably in the world. So the ability to make good quality decisions is paramount, but the correlation between that and their ability to be a good public speaker and orator, there's an overlap, but it's not a big one.
It's the transition team that you were responsible largely for putting in place. In New Zealand, of course, a government changes, the team remains essentially the same because we're talking about the bureaucracy and key people in that. Some would say that because there is this transition team and because there's a new broom in Washington, that you don't have a level of transparency. They're all sympathetic to the president.
Yeah,
and not to the public necessarily.
We'll start with the process, which is an interesting one, and then address your point. It is fascinating because you get a totally new team in, and that one of the reasons why I spent 6 months is to plan for that. 50 years ago, if you go back to presidential transitions, they woke up the day after the election and went, oh, okay, now how do I run this country? People figured out that in the single biggest country in the world with more issues than you can deal with, that wasn't a particularly good way of running it. But I'm not sure it's significantly different in the sense that he then goes and chooses his team. I think one of the things that's positive about the American system, and one of the things I enjoyed about doing it, is you then go out and handpick the people that you want, and they can be the best from any field, whether it be political people, business people, academics, think tank leaders. And the quality of an administration is often defined by the choices the president then makes and the people that he had. Now, I would argue that President Obama, to some extent, has been disappointing in some of his choices. He had, especially in his first term, where the world was inspired by him becoming president, and he came in with this massive goodwill, and he could have basically brought anyone into his administration. And generally speaking, he chose people who had been his loyalists for 20 or 30 years, whether they were the best people available or not. When we sat down with Mitt 4 or 5 months before the election, because one of the 3 key things that we had to do in the transition was to create short lists of people who would take all the senior White House positions and all of the cabinet positions.
Are these people who put up their hands?
No, I'll come to that. But the point I want to make is what Mitt said is, look, I'm not a Washington insider. I'm not coming with 100 people who I'm going to tell you their names, and I want you to find spots for them. I've got 3 or 4 people who I think are incredibly talented, who've been with me for a while. I'd like to make sure that they have some role in the government, but the rest is up to you. I want the best and brightest. I want you to draw it. I don't care who they are, what their background is. I just want you to find the best possible people because we're on a mission here. It comes back to my low ego point. He didn't care if he had people who outshone him, who had a great reputation. He didn't care whether they'd been with him for 30 years or not. All he wanted was the best people. And I can genuinely say that because that was one of the 3 things that I was primarily responsible for, is creating the lists of people. So we had a fantastic field day in terms of actually thinking of people who came from a vastly diverse background. Now, to your point, who are they and where do they come from?
And do they put up their hands? I mean, there must be a clamour because the pulling power of a would-be president must be pretty good.
There's a lot of people, they come from different sources, and then I'll talk a bit about the process. So one is, and this is the interesting thing about the American system, is when you go out of government, you're out. But what happens is a lot of people, if they've been in the political world for 30 years and that's their life, they then disappear into a lobbying group or a think tank or something waiting for the next 4-year cycle. So if you like, there's this bench of people that are sitting there in waiting for their next opportunity. So let's assume that gives you one pool of people to draw from. Then there's the private sector, and there's a long history, which I think is a positive history, of drawing people from the private sector, in particular things like Secretary of Treasury, obviously the more economic areas, but also Secretary of Commerce, of small business, so other areas, and so you can draw people from the private sector. Academia is another big thing, so people who might be vice chancellors of universities, for example, would be other people who might want to come and be in the education field. And they sign up for 4 years, or less for that matter. And there's obviously people who have been there all their life, so they create a body of knowledge that's incredibly important. But you also get these other people who just come and say, hey, look, what a fantastic thing to do for 4 years of my life, to contribute to my country and then go back to my day job, whatever that might be. Now, we don't let people put their hands up. We basically said no decisions are going to be made until the day after the election, so that you don't get this food fight of people clambering around you. Inevitably, some people, put their hands up and say, should you be interested? I would be interested. But we did everything essentially blind, so no one knew that they were being considered for anything.
Oh, really?
No.
Oh, so you could come up with some lovely secrets for us here and tell us who from the private sector was interested.
I could.
Yeah, I assume there's no answer on that one.
No. But we did, one of the interesting things is you have to vet all these people because, to your point, we go back through everyone who we considered for a senior position. The president appoints 4,000 people, by the way, so it's quite a big, obviously the Secretary of State and Treasury are the ones that people are interested in, but there's this huge pipeline that you have to fill of undersecretaries and deputy secretaries. But every person who we considered for the wave one positions, as we called them, we had to do a vetting of. So we had a huge room of people who did nothing else except search the internet for unfortunate quotes or stances on positions.
I actually got those from a book I read, Chris.
Well, it's all a matter of public record now, and it's one of the things we all know. In the digital world, everything you do through your life is recorded.
Do you think New Zealand could learn something from, like, the bureaucracy? I mean, we have career bureaucrats going through and they become naturally heads of departments. We never ever bring anybody in from, say, for example, business.
I think it's incredibly healthy, yeah, I do. I think you need a mixture. Obviously, you can't have too many people just coming in and then going again. You need the experience, and particular things like diplomatic areas where the sensitivities are higher, but things like economic policy, absolutely.
During the campaign, the thing that struck me was that China was almost seen as the bogeyman, that was almost reminiscent of Reds under the beds during Muldoon's era. What is so wrong with China? I mean, why did they try and outscore each other on China and how bad it is to do deals and what have you?
Well, I mean, China's the most obvious because it's it's the single biggest country in the world outside of the US, and it's growing at 10% or so a year, and it's the biggest trading imbalance that the US has. But it's representative of a broader issue, which is you're seeing the rise of emerging countries, China being the most obvious, but there's plenty of other, India, Southeast Asian countries, South American countries, and you're seeing US has 330 million people. You add up the rest of the countries you just talked about, it's 3 or 4 billion. So you have this massive change in the world going on and the emergence of these countries. And Bill Gates, who you referred to earlier, had a great expression which I use a lot, which is people overestimate the short-term impact of things, they underestimate the long-term impact of things. People have been talking about China for a long time. People have been talking about Asia and
why are we so worried about it?
Because it's going to happen.
Well, we're not, because we've got a free trade agreement, but the United States seems to.
Because it's going to happen. I mean, they are going to be an incredibly dominant force in the world, both economically and politically, almost certainly in the next 10 to 20 years.
So it's a bit like a competition. They don't like China having the competitive edge.
Well, it's more than just that. I mean, if you look at the unemployment situation in the US, which is one of the biggest issues that domestically is facing, it's 8%, but it's actually higher than that if you take the people who just don't even bother applying for work. It's the highest structural unemployment that the country's had since the 1930s, the Great Depression. And it's not going to change. What you have in the world at the moment is, and this is the flip side of productivity and outsourcing, is you have a massive dislocation of a huge number of people who are unskilled. So if you think there's 3 types of jobs in the world, there's skilled and localized, so think engineers or architects, so it's very hard to outsource those. There's unskilled and very hard to outsource, so think waiters and hairdressers. So those people are fine, although the second group aren't going to earn much money. And then the third group is skilled and outsourceable, so think manufacturing jobs. And in the world that we're talking about and what the rise of China, those jobs are gone and they're not unlikely to come back without a significant change. And when you have literally billions of people in the world who are willing to work for a significantly lower price and do the same job in those skilled areas, you have a massive problem. And it's not a competition thing, it's how do you deal with the reality of that situation?
But then both Romney and Obama were being maybe disingenuous when they were saying we want to keep jobs in this country, whereas China's...
Well, you have to have a vision of how you're going to create the jobs. Otherwise, you can't just say, oh, we're going to accept 10% unemployment forever. So you have to have a vision, but protecting them and trying to keep them there by trade policy, unlikely to be successful. Never been successful in the history of mankind, so unlikely to be. So you get into things like education policy and how do you retrain people and train people for the world that we're going into. And that's where the argument was much more interesting than, is China's currency overvalued or undervalued?
If we, because we want to take some questions shortly, but if you look at New Zealand and New Zealand's place in the world, I mean, New Zealand's little more than a blip on the radar screen, really, and right back to the mid-80s, following David Lange and the anti-nuclear legislation and George Shultz saying we part as friends, and Colin Powell saying we're very, very, very good friends, and positive spin being put on all of that. Why? And basically they're telling us to get stuffed. But why are we so worried? Why were they so worried about New Zealand? I mean, we are so small and insignificant, aren't we?
Well, Americans by nature, and this is one of the things I like them, are generally speaking black and white, and you're an ally or you're not. And sometimes you define whether you're an ally by whether you support the causes. Now, of course, New Zealand has a fantastic history with the US. I think we're the only country, maybe with Australia, of having fought every war alongside America. So there's no question that we have historically been an ally. But the nuclear thing obviously was a test of that. And subsequently, okay, we've moved on from that, which is great. But Americans judge people's actions by whether they align themselves or not. And America sees itself, for better or worse, as the policeman of the world. And so having people as allies is pretty damn critical from their perspective.
New Zealand, as I said, is tiny. I mean, in Washington, do we rate it all?
I think Mike Moore's done a fantastic job. I think we couldn't ask for a better ambassador there. And
he's now being called Prime Minister for 8 years rather than 8 weeks when he was here. So,
is that right?
He's being very flattered in the United States.
Well, I think it is driven around individuals and personality, and Mike really has done a great job there. New Zealand, it's true of the boxing above our weight or whatever the metaphor is. We do that politically as well. Relative to the size of the country, we have an outsourced presence there. People are very positive about the country. They love coming here. They know New Zealanders. Mike's done a great job. Now, we aren't, we had a list of countries that President-elect Romney was going to ring on the day after the election. I hate to say New Zealand wasn't in the top 5.
I thought you would have had more influence than that.
Well, there you go. I fell down on the job on that one. So we have to be realistic that with our 4.4 million people or whatever, we aren't a giant politically, but we're definitely disproportionate to our size.
Why is it so important, just a bit of a corollary to that, why is it so important that we have a seat, non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council? I mean, the last couple of weeks in South America, Key was lobbying furiously for it. Why is it important that New Zealand has a seat on that?
I can't speak to the specifics of the seat or not. I don't know, to be honest. Why do
is
I
it
think
influence, maybe?
Why do I think we should have a role? I mean, I think New Zealand is seen as a very honest broker in situations, and our opinion counts because we are, neutral, if you like, and we're not. Because we don't have a huge vested interest in the result of a lot of these things, we're seen as, we're intelligent, we're moderate, and so I think people respect our opinion.
You said when you went into this business of politics that it was going to be a fascinating experience or an alternative career. So what was the alternative career, I might ask in the beginning?
Oh, if we'd won, I would definitely like to work in the administration.
What would have you done? What could you see yourself?
We played by our own rules, so there was no, even for the people who worked on the transition, there were no guaranteed jobs at all. All of that was to come straight afterwards.
And why would you like that? Is it power?
I think the world is at a fascinating juncture at the moment. Some of the things we touched on, in particular economics, which is clearly more my interest. And I think what the US does, despite the rise of China, the US is still the most powerful and influential country in the world by a distance. And so to be involved in that process for 4+ years and to be close to the decision making associated with economic policy in the US and therefore by definition the world, I can't think of anything more intellectually interesting than that.
Are you going to remain involved?
Yeah, it's a 4-year cycle, so I'll make the specific decision in 3.5 years or so. But one of the things I did post-election is I've documented everything that we did in the transition. So I co-wrote a book with one of my colleagues there, and we to some extent created the gold standard in transition planning, even though it wasn't implemented, by applying some of the basic project management skills that I referred to, a little bit of the engineering training in me. But transitions generally aren't the primary focus. Everyone wants to be on the campaign because that's where the excitement is, that's where the debates are, until about a month out from the election, and they start getting very interested in the transition.
Yeah.
So it's a nice little niche that I sort of worked on, and so I've documented all of what we did, and we'll publish it in a book in a month or two. But that gives me something that I could pick up in 3 years' time and do again, if I felt so inclined.
Just finally, before we go to questions, on election night, I was in Chicago.
Right.
Presumably you were in Washington.
No, Boston.
You were up in Boston
Yeah.
with Romney, okay.
Yeah.
Did you think at the beginning of that day that Romney could still win?
Yeah.
I think everybody did, didn't they?
Everyone did, and turnout's a fickle thing.
And that's the problem, really, isn't it?
And you don't know until the votes are counted, and sometimes the mood of the country can be more unexpected. There have been a lot of surprises, as you will know, having been in the business a lot longer than me. There can be surprises. I think we were realistic, we had an outside shot, but we definitely thought we had a shot. And I mean, one of the interesting things is if you did a straw poll with people, what did President Obama's, how many votes did he get this time relative to how many he got last time? Most people would think, oh, about the same. Well, no, he got about 10% less. So one of the elements of what we thought would happen, which is there'd be an enthusiasm drop off from 2008 to 12, happened. What we didn't do is we didn't get the enthusiasm pickup. So we got an extra 1 million votes. He got about 5 million less than what he did. But it shows you, he had a 5 million vote swing, and we had a 5 million positive vote swing, then we would have won the election. So it's possible.
It is much harder, isn't it, for a challenger than an incumbent when you fight an election like they do in the United States?
Yeah, the incumbent definitely has advantages. The building the war chest, the building of what's described as the ground game, which is getting votes out. So obviously, if you know you are going to be the candidate, you've got 4 years to build a nationwide series of offices that start to connect with people, and you build an information system. And this might sound tactical, but in fact it's incredibly important because of the turnout factor that I talked about. And literally people, and the Obama campaign were very good at this. They did an exceptional job. Things like, as someone would come in and vote and they'd come out, they'd tick them off and they'd get that person to ring their neighbour. Now, if someone just rings anonymously and says, would love you to go out and vote, you probably don't do it. If your neighbour rings you, you probably do. And of course, because you have 4 years, generally speaking, you can figure out who's going to vote which way. People register as Republicans or Democrats and to some extent independents. So you have a real ability to actually get down at a grassroots level and think about how you get voter turnout. If you were the challenger, you got 6 months to do it.
How tough was it, finally, we will go to questions, but how tough was it when the Sandy storm hit the United States and during the campaign, and Obama goes back to the White House and Romney is sort of sitting there cooling his heels for 2 or 3 days? That must have been terribly frustrating.
It was, in particular, and it's all lost in history now, of course, but there was definitely a bit of a momentum pickup in those last few days, and the sizes of the rallies on the Romney side were getting bigger. But, honestly, I think it was a factor, but wasn't the factor. I don't think it made the difference.
Okay, well, we'll open it up for questions. I'm sure there are many more intelligent questions than I've asked tonight. So we've got a microphone going around the audience. So if you do want to ask a question, raise your hand. And we've got one down here, and we'll get a microphone to you.
Chris, from your international experience at such a high level of business and government, if you had the opportunity to come back to New Zealand and wave a magic wand, what key thing or things would you actually change?
Ooh. Well, I think this is probably true of the US as well. And it's not just because we're sitting here, but education policy to me is the single most important thing in terms of, to get right in terms of the world that we're going into. I think New Zealand actually has done remarkably well over the last decade economically. So I wouldn't get into infrastructure spending and things like that. All of those are important. But if we got our education policy so that we were producing world-class graduates and we had the top 3, and there's no reason why we couldn't be in skills right through every age 5 through university, wow, that would make more difference to this country than anything else I can think of. So if I could wave a magic wand, it'd be that.
We have another question.
Hi, Chris. You actually spoke at my graduation from Auckland University about 13 years ago, so good to see you again. Thanks. I currently work for Intel and I live in Hong Kong. 2 questions for you. If you can say anything about the innovation programs or the technology programs that Mitt Romney was putting in place, and specifically about Mr. Paul Otellini, who has just turned in his resignation from Intel, subsequently after Mitt didn't come into power. Right. That'd be interesting. But more importantly, over the next 10 years, where do you see New Zealand taking advantage of China and the growth in China from either a business standpoint or an export from New Zealand to China standpoint?
Got it. One of the tragedies of the US, to address your question on one aspect of it, one of the tragedies of the US is it does have, or used to have, the premier education system in the world. It's certainly still got something like 15 of the top 20 universities in the world. But one of the things it does is then it exports all the graduates. And one of the big political campaign discussions was, why on earth don't, as you graduate from MIT, you staple a green card to your diploma as you come out? And it's crazy. The US is basically educating the Chinese and Indian populations. So one of the big themes there is they have the world-class universities. They have a fantastic history and pedigree of people coming in, but they come and then go. And if you could do one thing to change the US, because it has been the world, certainly in the technology sense, the world's innovator, it would be to keep all of those people. How do you keep the Indians and Chinese and Eastern Europeans of this world inside the US system? Because with Silicon Valley and what's happening in Boston and New York, you've just got a fantastic machine that just keeps producing, the Facebooks and newcomers as well as the mature businesses. In terms of New Zealand and China, I'm not sure I can speak that authoritatively to it, to be honest. Obviously, we have a very strong, growth there. In terms of adding value to our products, was something I spent a lot of time on the Carter Holt. Probably wasn't as successful as I would like to be. But rather than just producing raw product and sending it up to China, having a value-added strategy is, and I can't say I can articulate that, but that would seem to me the biggest single opportunity we've got. We produce a lot of protein, we produce a lot of fibre that the Chinese want. Thinking about how we add the value here rather than there would be the industrial policy I'd be thinking about.
The Pope at his inauguration in Rome said that the role of the church is to serve the people. If the Republican Party had won the presidential election, would they have seen their role to serve the people of the United States, or would it have been to rule in favour of a certain proportion of those people?
Is that the 47%? Oh.
Yeah, I think that once the campaign is over, both parties have a very proud history of actually then trying to do the best thing for the country. Obviously, there's fundamental differences in the way in which they interpret what the best means. But do I think a Mitt Romney administration or a Republican administration would have only been interested in one half of the population? No. And that's never been the history of the Republican Party. It's never been the history of the Democrat Party either. So what happens on the campaign trail when they fight each other like hell is one thing. What then happens in government is another. And you have to remember that one of the interesting things about the US system is there's three legs to the government, the presidential being the most obvious one, but then the Senate and the House being the others. So you tend to get a much more representative form of government simply because it's very unusual to have all of those three legs of the government held by one party or another. The last time, actually, interestingly, was in just after 2008 when the Democrats held all three. But generally speaking, you get a much more balanced equation, for better or for worse, because you have split government between those three parties. But, obviously given the spirit of your question, do I think that the Republicans were single-mindedly only interested in the people who were backing them, and do I think Mitt Romney? No, I think he was a much bigger person than that.
Just one question while we're waiting. I was thinking, Governor Christie, if you stay in the political arena, do you think you'll be basically backing him or working for him?
Do I think he will be the candidate who wins? I think he's got a good chance, but it's really early days. There's 3 or 4 relatively young candidates in the Republican Party who, within another 3 years, will be very strong contenders. So I think he is a contender, but not
a foregone conclusion.
No, not at all.
Hi, Chris. With the US being embroiled in the sequester spending cuts right now, in your opinion, under a Romney administration, would this have still happened? And what type of fiscal policy would he have implemented to prevent that?
No, I don't think it would have happened because I think he would have made a much stronger and more... Sometimes you need a change in order to effect change. And unfortunately, President Obama basically has carried on the same approach as he had in the first 4 years. Entirely his prerogative, but hasn't been successful in terms of bringing people together. I think Mitt would have been much more successful in bringing people together. And just sometimes a different person and different personality makes a difference. I also think he would have put in place a different fiscal policy on the long term and actually been able to give people a vision of a change. It's one of the reasons why I signed up for him. So, no, I don't think the sequester would have happened in the way that it did under his leadership. But who knows? It would have also depended on the composition of the other two parts. But, the interesting thing is both parties think the sequester is a dumb idea. So you have a crazy situation where neither party actually wants it to happen, but they were unable to resolve a middle ground to change it. And one of the fascinating things is democracies aren't particularly well set up for taking things away from people. Generally speaking, the last couple of 100 years, they've been about how do you divide an increasing pie. The US is, you see it in Europe in particular, but the US is now facing how does a democracy deal with a shortage of resource and not a shrinking pie, but a pie that is growing too slowly to cater for all the demands that it has upon us. That's a really tough challenge. So, it's going to have to change.
Chris, good evening. Could you rate the 2 social media campaigns and compare the effectiveness? And did they really make a difference?
I believe so. I think there's a report just come out, and I've been here for a few days, so I haven't seen it, by the Republican Party, an analysis of the social media campaign. So I'd be interested to read that. I think certainly anecdotally, the Obama campaign was vastly more effective. That tended to appeal to a much younger demographic for a start, which obviously helps in this. It also it built on a lot of how successful they were in 2008 and carried that on. It was a little, as I mentioned before, one of the benefits of incumbency is you can have a 4-year campaign rather than a 6-month campaign. But they were very effective and they hired some very good people. And I think you would say the Republican Party were okay. The Obama campaign was gold standard. And do I think it made a difference? Yeah, I do.
Well, I think we could probably wrap it up there, Chris. It's been fantastic having you here. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody here tonight. Great to have you back in the country.
Thank you.
As somebody suggested earlier, maybe you should come back and give politics here. But it's been great talking to you. I'm sure we could have gone on longer, but I know you've got to go out and see a bit of Auckland tonight. Thank you very much for coming.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, mate. Well done. Thanks.